She had $11 in her checking account. He'd just handed her more than she made in 3 months, and she was chasing him down to give it back. Her name was Diane Foster, and until that night, nobody in Millbrook, Ohio had ever had a reason to remember it. She had worked the evening shift at Della's Diner for 6 years, wiping down the same laminate counter, refilling the same chipped mugs, folding the same paper napkins into the same tight triangles, because it made the tip jar look fuller than it usually was. She kept a photograph of her son taped inside her locker, curling at the corners from humidity and time. She had $11.40 in her checking account that Tuesday night, and she knew the exact number because she had checked it twice on her phone during her break, standing outside by the dumpsters where the cell signal was strongest. The man who left the money had been sitting in booth 6 for almost 2 hours. He wore a coat that did not quite fit him, the kind a person buys off a rack when they are trying not to be noticed rather than trying to look good. He ordered black coffee and a bowl of vegetable soup, and barely touched either one. Diane had refilled his coffee 3 times without being asked, because something in the way he sat, elbows on the table, shoulders curled forward, eyes fixed on nothing, reminded her of every exhausted parent who had ever come through that door after a double shift of their own. She did not know his name, she did not know what he did for a living, she only knew that he looked like a man who had not slept properly in a long time. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What Diane remembered most, later, was the receipt. It sat folded in half on the vinyl seat of booth 6, tucked under the edge of an empty coffee cup as if it had been placed there deliberately rather than left behind by accident. The bill itself came to $14.20. The tip line, written in a hand that pressed too hard into the paper, read $1,300. Diane read the number twice, then a third time, holding the receipt an inch from her face under the fluorescent light above the register. She looked up toward the parking lot, where a black car she did not recognize was still idling at the far edge of the lot, headlights on, engine running, going nowhere. Diane had grown up 30 minutes outside Millbrook, in a house with a leaning porch and a mother who worked 2 jobs of her own. She had wanted, once, to study nursing, and had gotten as far as a single semester of community college before her son Eli was born, and the numbers on the tuition bill stopped making sense against the numbers in her bank account. She did not talk about that unfinished semester with anyone at the diner. She kept the acceptance letter in a shoebox at the back of her closet, unopened again in years, the way a person keeps a door closed, not because they have forgotten what is behind it, but because they have not yet decided whether they can afford to look. She raised Eli mostly alone, picking up every double shift Frank would give her, and she had learned, the hard way, that $11.40 could either last until Friday, or it could not, depending on things entirely outside her control. Her manager, Frank Tolliver, was the one who told her to just deposit it. He had worked at Della's for 22 years and had seen every kind of customer come through, the generous ones, the cruel ones, the ones who left a Bible verse where a tip should be. He leaned against the register with his arms crossed and told Diane that whatever the man's reasons were, they were not her business, and that a mistake in her favor was still a mistake in her favor. He said it kindly, the way a man says something he has told himself more than once in his own life. Diane folded the receipt again along its original crease. She did not answer him. She was already reaching for her jacket. The rain had started sometime during her shift without her noticing, the way weather does when a person spends 8 hours under fluorescent light with their back to the windows. By the time Diane pushed through the front door of Della's, it was coming down hard enough to blur the parking lot lights into long yellow smears across the wet asphalt. The black car had not moved. Its headlights were still on. Its engine was still running, low and steady, the exhaust curling upward into the rain like something breathing in the cold. Diane crossed the lot at a run, one hand pressed over the receipt in her apron pocket to keep it dry, the other raised toward the driver's side window, already calling out for the car to wait. She would later describe what she saw through that window as the moment the entire night stopped making sense. The man from booth 6 was slumped forward against the steering wheel, one hand pressed flat against his own chest, his knuckles white, his breathing visible in short, uneven pulls that fogged the inside of the glass. He was not reaching for his phone. He was not reaching for the door. He was simply sitting there, motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his shoulders, as if some part of him had already decided this was where the night would end. Diane did not think about the money in her pocket. She did not think about her manager's advice, or her checking account, or the $11.40 that had felt so heavy an hour earlier. She pulled the door handle and it opened. What happened in the next 4 minutes would later be reconstructed from 3 separate sources: Diane's own account, the transcript of the emergency call, and the statement of the paramedics who arrived on scene. None of them fully agreed on the smaller details. All 3 agreed on the larger ones. Diane climbed into the passenger seat, phone already against her ear, giving the dispatcher the cross streets from memory, because she had driven past that intersection every day of her working life. She kept her voice level. She told the man, whose name she still did not know, to keep looking at her, to keep talking, to tell her anything at all. His favorite color, the last movie he had seen, the name of a street he grew up on. She would later say she did not know why she asked those particular questions. She only knew that a man who is talking is a man who is still breathing. The paramedics arrived in under 7 minutes, which in a town the size of Millbrook was closer to a small miracle than a matter of routine. They would later confirm what Diane already suspected in the dark of that car, that the minutes between her opening that door and their arrival were not incidental. They were the difference between a story that ended in a hospital bed and a story that ended in a parking lot. As they loaded him onto the gurney, one of the paramedics turned to Diane, still standing in the rain with her uniform soaked through and the receipt gone soft and unreadable in her pocket, and asked if she was family. She said no. She said she was just the waitress who brought him his coffee. The hospital where the ambulance took him was a 40-minute drive from Millbrook, and Diane did not learn which one until she called the dispatcher back the following morning, still in her work clothes from the night before, sitting at her kitchen table with the shoebox from her closet pushed aside to make room for a cup of coffee she did not drink. Eli had asked her, over cereal, why she looked like she had not slept, and she had told him only that a customer at work had gotten sick, and that she had helped him get to an ambulance in time. She did not mention the receipt. She did not mention the number written on it. Some part of her had already decided, without fully articulating it to herself, that the amount of money involved was not a detail her son needed to carry into his school day. By the time Diane walked back inside Della's diner, the story of what had happened in that parking lot had already started to take a shape she did not recognize. A group of regulars near the window had watched the ambulance lights through the rain-streaked glass and drawn their own conclusions long before anyone had the facts. Someone said the waitress had run out after the rich man's car to keep him from calling the police over something. Someone else said she had probably taken something from his coat and gotten caught. By the following morning, a version of the story had reached the local paper before Diane had even slept, framed as a question rather than a fact, the kind of headline designed to make a reader assume the worst while the writer stayed technically innocent of saying it outright. Frank Tolliver was the one who eventually set the record straight, though it took him 2 full days to gather the nerve. He pulled the security footage from the diner's outdated camera system, the kind that recorded in grainy black and white and rarely got checked unless something went wrong. It showed exactly what Diane had described: the receipt on the seat, her reaction at the register, her run across the parking lot in the rain toward a car that was not moving. It showed her opening that door not to take something, but to give something back. Frank brought the footage himself to the newspaper office, still in his apron, and told the editor that the story they had printed was not just incomplete, it was backwards. The rumor did not stay contained to the regulars by the window. Within 2 days, a customer who had never once eaten at Della's diner before that week began stopping by during the lunch rush, phone held low against the edge of the table, filming Diane without asking as she carried plates between booths. A photo of her, unflattering and out of context, appeared beneath the local paper's article by Thursday morning, captioned with a question mark instead of an accusation, which somehow felt worse. Diane kept working through it. She did not call in sick. She did not ask Frank for time off. She told herself, quietly, that a person who runs from a rumor only teaches the rumor that it was right to chase her, and she was not willing to give it that satisfaction. What no one in Millbrook knew yet, what would not come out until nearly a week later, was why a man worth more money than the entire town's annual budget had been sitting alone in a diner booth with a coat that did not fit him, writing a tip 4 figures larger than his bill. His name was Robert Ashland, and for almost 30 years he had built and run one of the largest private logistics companies in the country, a business empire that had made him wealthy enough to never again need to sit in a diner booth unrecognized. And yet, that was precisely what he had been doing for the better part of 6 months. Driving through small towns alone, ordering food he barely touched, watching the people around him the way a man watches something he is afraid he has lost the ability to trust. The explanation, when it finally surfaced, was smaller and stranger than anyone expected. Robert's assistant of 11 years, a woman named Sandra Kim, had spent that same week finalizing a large anonymous donation to a regional hospital fundraiser, one Robert had approved weeks earlier, without much thought, distracted at the time by matters that felt more urgent. A clerical error in the transfer system, a single misrouted authorization, a receipt number entered into the wrong field, had caused a portion of that donation to appear instead on a restaurant tab 3 states away, on a night Robert happened to be sitting in that exact restaurant. He had not written $1,300 on purpose. He had written $13, his hand shaking slightly from what would later be diagnosed as an early cardiac episode, and the system behind him had done the rest without his knowledge. But an accident of arithmetic does not explain why Robert Ashland had been driving from town to town for 6 months in a coat that did not fit him. That answer went back further, to a boardroom meeting 8 months earlier where his nephew, Preston Ashland, had quietly begun assembling the paperwork to have Robert declared unfit to run the company he built, citing stress, erratic behavior, and a series of medical appointments Robert had tried to keep private. Robert had learned of the attempt almost by accident, through a lawyer who had once been loyal to him and still was. He had not fought it in court, he had simply left. He told no one where he was going. He wanted, for the first time in decades, to sit somewhere he was not being watched, evaluated, or measured for weakness, and to find out whether there was still a single person left in the world who would treat him with basic decency without knowing what he was worth. In the 6 months before that night, Robert had eaten in 11 different diners across 4 states, and in every one of them he had run some version of the same quiet, unspoken test. He left ordinary tips in most of them, watched how servers treated him when there was nothing unusual to notice, and moved on the next morning without ever revealing who he was. In 2 of those diners, staff had recognized him despite the plain coat, and the service had changed instantly. Warmer, more attentive, subtly angling for a moment of his time he had learned to recognize and resent. He had begun to believe, somewhere around the 4th or 5th stop, that there was no longer a version of kindness directed at him that was not, in some way, transactional. Della's diner was supposed to be one more stop on a list he had nearly stopped keeping. He would later describe that night at Della's diner as the moment he stopped being able to tell himself the answer was no. Diane had refilled his coffee without being asked. She had noticed he looked unwell without saying so directly, only bringing him a glass of water and quietly telling him to take his time. She had asked him nothing about who he was or why he was there. And when the receipt system malfunctioned and sent him a false, oversized total for the hospital donation, some instinct in him, exhausted, frightened, and strangely clear, had let it stand rather than correct it. as if some part of him wanted to see what a stranger would do with more money than she had ever held at once. He had not expected her to chase the car down in the rain to give it back. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, for her to simply keep it, the way anyone in her position reasonably might. Robert spent 9 days in the hospital recovering from what doctors called a cardiac event brought on by prolonged stress and a heart condition he had been ignoring for the better part of a year. Diane visited only once, and only because a hospital administrator had personally called to ask her to, explaining that Mr. Ashland had been asking for the waitress by name since the morning after he was admitted. She sat beside his bed in her work uniform, still smelling faintly of the diner, and told him the same thing she had told him in the parking lot, that he should stop worrying about things that were not his job to carry alone. He laughed for the first time in what the nurses later said was days. He told her the money had never been a test. It had been a mistake. What happened after the mistake, he said, was the only part of the night that mattered. Preston Ashland, the nephew whose paperwork had set the entire 6 months in motion, did not attend the hospital during Robert's 9-day stay. He sent a single arrangement of flowers with a card signed by an assistant rather than in his own hand, and Robert had it moved to the nurse's station on the 2nd floor rather than keep it in his room. When Robert was released, he did not confront Preston directly or pursue any public dispute over the attempted filing. He simply had his lawyer quietly withdraw every document that had made his nephew's case possible to begin with, closing the door without ever raising his voice about it, and began the slow work of deciding how much of the company he still wanted to run himself, and how much he was finally willing to hand to people who had earned it rather than maneuvered for it. The public version of the story, once it reached beyond Millbrook, focused almost entirely on the money. The headline writers could not resist the shape of it, a billionaire's accidental fortune, landing in the hands of a struggling single mother who gave it back without hesitation. What that version left out was smaller and harder to put into a headline. It left out the fact that Diane never once asked Robert for anything, not during his hospital stay, not in the weeks after, not when reporters began calling Della's diner looking for a comment. It left out the particular quiet of the drive home she took that first rainy night, alone in her car with the heater barely working, replaying the sound of a stranger's breathing and wondering only whether he would be alive by morning. The money had never been the reason she ran. In the weeks between the hospital and his return, Robert spent time doing something he had not done since he was a young man, building the first version of his company out of a rented warehouse. He went through old files by hand, rather than delegating the task to an assistant, reading through decades of decisions he had made about people, about trust, about which relationships in his life had been built on genuine regard, and which had simply been convenient for as long as convenience lasted. He found, sorting through those files late at night in a house that had always felt larger than it needed to be, that he could name almost every business partner who had ever profited from knowing him. He struggled to name more than a handful of people who had ever helped him expecting nothing back. Diane's name went on that second, much shorter list, and it stayed there. Robert Ashland returned to Millbrook 2 months later, this time without the coat that did not fit him. He walked into Della's diner on a Tuesday evening during Diane's shift, sat down in booth 6, as if no time had passed, and asked for black coffee and a bowl of vegetable soup. He told her, once she had a moment to sit across from him, that he had spent much of his recovery deciding what to do about his nephew's attempt to remove him from the company, and that he had ultimately chosen not to fight it with anger, but to step back from daily control on his own terms, on a timeline he had chosen, rather than one forced upon him. He said the diner, and the woman who worked in it, had reminded him what it felt like to make a decision that had nothing to do with power. He also told her, in the plain and unhurried way people speak when they have already made peace with a decision, that he had established a trust in her son's name, not as a reward for chasing his car down in the rain, he was careful to say, but because she had never once tried to collect on what she had done. The fund would cover the boy's education from that point through college. Administered quietly through a foundation, with Robert's name nowhere attached to it publicly. Diane did not cry in front of him. She would later say she waited until her shift ended, sitting in her car in the same parking lot where the black car had once idled in the rain, before she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Frank Tolliver still tells the story to new hires at Della's Diner, usually on their first slow Tuesday night, usually while pointing toward booth 6 without quite looking at it directly. He tells them about the receipt, about the rain, about a waitress who could have kept quiet and told no one, and no one would have ever known the difference. He does not tell it as a story about money, because by his own account, that was never really the point of it. He tells it as a story about the version of a person that shows up when nobody with any power is watching to reward it. Diane still works the same shift at the same counter, folding the same napkins into the same tight triangles, not because she has to anymore, but because she has decided, deliberately, that she wants to. There is a question this story leaves behind that no headline ever quite captured, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before moving on to whatever comes next in the feed. Robert Ashland did not test Diane Foster on purpose. The mistake that sent $1,300 to her table was exactly that, a mistake, born of a broken system and a man too unwell to notice the error in time. But what he discovered by accident is the same thing every person eventually discovers about themselves, usually when they least expect the lesson. Character is not the thing people display when they know they are being measured. It is the thing that shows up in an empty parking lot, in the rain, when no one else is watching, and there is nothing to gain by doing the right thing except the simple, unremarkable fact of having done it. Would you have chased the car, or kept the envelope? Be honest with yourself before you answer in the comments below, because the honest answer is rarely as simple as it sounds from the outside. If stories like this one, about the moments that quietly reveal who someone really is, are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe now, because next week's story is about a family that kept a secret for 17 years, and the single photograph that finally brought it to light.